Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the inaugural year of the Tufts Faculty Webinar Series. This series is a new initiative launched by the Tufts University Alumni Association to provide continuing education to our alumni around the world. We will be offering live one-hour webinars throughout the academic year on relevant topics delivered by some of the most dynamic faculty on campus. For our attendees, we are recording this webinar. An on-demand version will be available on the Tufts Alumni playlist in a few days. Also, your audio has been turned off, so you may submit questions for the presenters by typing them into the chat box in the lower right of your screen. For any questions that go unaddressed before our 1 p.m. stop time, we will follow up with an email. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to the professors who will be discussing Digitizing Darcy Thompson's Glossary of Greek Birds.
Thank you, Joda. So it's my pleasure to be opening this webinar, and thanks everyone for attending. I'd like to introduce my colleagues first of all. So I'm Marie-Claire Beaulieu. I'm an associate professor in classics.
I'm Jennifer Burton. I'm a professor of the practice in drama and dance.
I'm Anthony Bucci. I'm a lecturer in the computer science department.
I'm Michael Reed. I'm a biology professor.
So we put together this team to address the work of a really influential scholar, and I don't know if I could get to the slides here. So this is us. And so we are talking about this scholar, Darcy Wentworth Thompson, and our project is to explore his work in an interdisciplinary way. So Thompson was best known for being a biologist and mathematician. He was very influential with his essay on growth and form. What interests us here is a lesser known work, perhaps, called the Glossary of Greek Birds. And in this glossary, Thompson demonstrates his mastery of biology, but also classics. He was a very accomplished Hellenist and Latinist and had a passion for all things Greek. And so he dedicated decades of his life to this work. He published the first edition of this glossary in 1896 and the second one in 1938 and kept working on it until his death in 1948. And what this glossary is really a list of Greek bird names which Thompson tries to match with a modern interpretation. So I can show you what this looks like. This is a quote from Thompson where he really explains how much different disciplines contribute to one another. So here's the glossary. This is the first edition, and here's the second edition, gets prettier. And third edition, this is a bit of video. I don't know if that's the play. Here's the what an entry looks like, right? So we have a Greek bird name called the Aithria in this particular case, and Darcy has a whole bunch of possible identifications with Latin names, English names. Then he's got reasoning, so he's trying to match this bird with real birds. So we've got all his reasoning statements here, and finally authorities. Modern ones and ancient authorities. So the real force of Darcy here is that he goes back to the ancient texts to look for what this bird might be. So as you can see, this is a really, really complex and diverse data set and needs to be approached from a variety of perspectives. Our goal is to make this available and understandable for as broad an audience as possible. So what we need to do is to parse it. So there's a data science part to this in putting this online and making the data set understandable, but there's also a big outreach part. So all of us here are contributing from our different perspectives to to achieving this goal. So I'd like maybe to turn it over to my colleagues if they'd like to say a bit about how they're approaching this project. I don't know.
Oh, sure. So I'm a filmmaker, and the project it combines all of these different areas of interest. So people interested in birds, people interested in, obviously, Greek texts, this sort of connection of knowledge over time. So it's really rich for exploring with film in that we can interview a wide variety of experts, we can look at the birds themselves, we can look at artistic images, it's very visual. And we had this incredible experience of going to Dundee in Scotland and seeing the handwritten and the hand-pasted and the little bits of paper that Darcy had put into this second edition that he was annotating sort of in preparation for a potential later edition. And it's incredibly visual, you know, so by filming it, we're able to sort of capture this, unless you're going to that library, you're not going to be able to see this and see, you know, this incredible depth of thought that he had. So it's just an exciting project for me, and I've been working with a number of Tufts students who've gotten involved in this to sort of show how you can bring together these webs in a visual way through these very short films.
Yeah, and I guess, so hi, I'm Anthony. My interest in Darcy in this work is from the computer science perspective. He, you know, each one of these entries is extremely dense in the sense that he's talking about, you know, Greek myths and modern biological facts as of his time and things that he knows himself. And, you know, some of these entries have Greek, Latin, and English in them, so there's multiple languages in some of these entries. And so it poses a really interesting challenge from a, say, natural language processing perspective to find ways to, if not automated, then at least semi-automated ways to extract some of this information out of these entries and make sense of them. So I think there's on the order of 200 entries. Some of them are quite long, some are short. And so how can you somehow unravel all of that text and attach into it more information that kind of embellishes it? So if there's a Greek word in there and I don't know Greek, the entry might be opaque to me, but if there's, you know, a little tag that tells me what that Greek word is or what source that is, then I can go read that myself and get a better view of what's going on. So we've looked at just straight up tagging the text, so kind of manually going through it. And, you know, there's some amount of expertise involved to decide, well, this bit of text is actually a reference to Aristotle, for example, and I don't know how to do that, but Marie-Claire has expertise in this. So she's actually painstakingly done some of what you see now, the XML markup. But we're also exploring some more automated ways to get at what his reasoning was in particular. So we've explored using a few techniques that their matrix decomposition techniques is kind of a broad category, but of sort of systematizing the information into a matrix and then decomposing that and seeing if we can find patterns in his writing or thinking in those matrices. So that's all fairly preliminary, but we have some interesting, you know, we've made some interesting headway in that respect, and hopefully that'll bear fruit eventually.
Hi, Michael. I'm a bird guy. I do research in biology on birds. I'm interested in how human activities affect the persistence or extinction of birds and how to keep birds going. But I'm also a birder by avocation, so I'm one of these lucky people who gets to work on his hobby. So I joined in because of the bird link, and when Marie-Claire came to me to talk about this, my view was this is all about birds are awesome, and I would like to be a part of that. So what I'm bringing into it is interest in natural history about the birds, because Darcy, as a biologist, writes in part for biologists, and when I see the account when he's trying to figure this species out, and one of the comments is, it's deaf and dumb. I don't know how they got the gull because they're obnoxiously raucous. So it's fun to go through the information just to see how well his accounts are standing up. And I'm also interested in expanding birds into a broader realm. So I've been interested in years in tying science to the public, and now this is a way of tying classics to the public. and both of the routes are through birds. So it's hard to go wrong with that because birds are awesome.
I agree with that. And to Michael's last point, I think that's really important here for me to be an ambassador for classics and to think about, like, how do we bring this in a way that that makes sense for people and in a way that relates also to the real world, right? So we're not talking about classics here in some sort of void. This is tied to real birds, real stories, and people saw these birds, you know, every day, and they told all kinds of stories about it. So, so I think that's very much the strength of this project for me is bringing classics into the real world here.
Yeah, I was going to tie in also with what you said about conservation, and I think that's a really important link in that by having these richness of stories from the classics and all the biology and communicating that, I think that it shows the many layers of importance of these birds for our shared history and for our, you know, moving forward. So I think that's just a really wonderful piece.
Well, and birds, I think probably since humans first could look up, people have been fascinated by birds and the fact that they could fly and they would disappear and come back. And it isn't surprising that they permeate classics, they permeate popular culture, and there's a large culture of bird watching and people putting seed out for birds at feeders, and if that can draw them into reading classics as well, it's hard to go wrong with that. And we're not going to have the Percy Jackson success, but we're headed that way.
I wonder if perhaps we could give an example, because we have all these slides about our friend the Aithria here, and maybe that makes it a little bit more concrete for our audience. So the Aithria was the entry that we were showing earlier, and as I've mentioned, Darcy made a first edition of the glossary in 1896, followed by a second edition in 1936. And as Jennifer mentioned, he had been working on a scrapbook for the rest of his life after that, so until 1948. So there's lots and lots of information there. So in his first edition in 1896, he identified this Aithria, which is a Greek word for a bird, as a gull. And Michael mentioned that there's some issues with that, but the characteristics he was using was that it was common in Greece and met criteria laid out by Aristotle. And Aristotle basically says that it nests in the spring and on the rocks by the shore. So basically, that's the first column that you see here on this beautiful chart. And so this identification was made basically on the basis of two ancient texts. The other one is the Odyssey, and that's Odyssey 5:333, if anyone wants to look that up. But that is the moment when Odysseus is drowning, and he's being pursued by Poseidon because his comrades did all kinds of things, and the gods are angry. And at this point, the comrades are all dead. Odysseus is sort of clinging on a raft. He's about to die, and he's sort of like basically just about to give up. And the goddess Leucothea comes to him in the form of this Aithria. And now Leucothea is interesting because she was a woman who was nursed the baby Dionysus and was driven mad by Hera because, of course, Dionysus was an illegitimate child of Zeus. So Leucothea was driven mad by Hera for nursing baby Dionysus. She killed her own children, and as a result, threw herself into the sea, and the gods took pity on her, made her into this goddess who takes the shape of this bird. So we have here two mortals who are on the edge of death, right, Odysseus and Leucothea, and she saves him at the last minute by giving her veil, which allows him to land safely in the Phaeacian land. Now, the question might be, what's the connection between Aristotle's account of a bird that nests on rocks and whatnot and this goddess who comes to save Odysseus, right? And Darcy is making this connection, and he's using these authorities to say there's got to be a gull, and he imagines this goddess. Leucothea means the white goddess, right? So that kind of makes sense as a gull. This big bird comes up to him, and so forth. Anyway, be that as it may, in between the two editions, there's a scholar of classics, William Ward Fowler, actually disputed Darcy's claim that it was a gull and said it has to be a shearwater. And his evidence was that Strabo, another classical author, mentions that this Aithvia nests in burrows by the shore, which changed everything for Darcy. And there he went on to use many more of these authorities. And here perhaps Michael wants to comment on these two identifications.
Well, and this is where natural history is so important, is gulls never nest underground, and shearwaters always nest underground. So, and they're both birds that hang out near the sea. Shearwaters will dip into the water and dive, and gulls don't, so there's some more evidence. So building on natural history information, they also, did you want to listen to the song here? One of the interesting things about shearwaters is they nest in these burrows, but they only come in at night. So the chicks stay inside the burrows and wait for the parents to come at night to feed them. And when they come in, they make very unusual sounds. So we can play a clip of it. So you can imagine if you're an uneducated person hanging out in a dark forest at night and you hear that a lot of things run through your imagination. And I'm sure these, and some of the seabirds sound more like crying babies and some sound like screaming children. And it's pretty intimidating. And it's easy to see that they might be the source of ghost stories or stories of monsters, and it's very easy to see how this would really work its way into a culture, especially around the coast or in the mountains where the birds breed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so if we look at the revised identification as a shearwater, then Darcy starts, actually he agrees with Ward Fowler and puts more on it, and he starts integrating these others. This slide. And these others actually integrate myths that discuss the tombs of Achilles and Diomedes and Memnon, who were fallen heroes from the Trojan War. And in these myths, there are birds that take care of the tombs of these fallen leaders. And these birds make these noises, and they're taught to live on these sort of ghost islands. So I think it really reaches Michael's point where you can imagine sailing by these islands by night, very dark, and you hear these things, right? And you know that there's some other myth that the tomb of this or that hero was in the area, so it's very easy to make that connection, right? And for me, it helps us understand maybe a little bit this Odyssey passage, because that's still kind of a question, why does she save him in the form of this bird, right? It doesn't seem to match the rest. But for me, this is a bird that seems to be sort of in between worlds, right? And I think the shearwater might work well as this dark bird that comes only at night and so forth, right? It would be nice if it were white, because ghosts are white, also in Greek culture, but I'll take it.
They're white on the belly.
That's true. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Jennifer. This is a shearwater.
Oh, about the Bella?
Yes.
Okay, so when we were thinking about how do we use film to show some of this information in a way that's not merely having people talk, we were inspired partly by Marie-Claire has been teaching, she taught a course that brought in Aristophanes, the birds, and students were so inspired from a wide range of different disciplines. So one of them was the student Bella, who was from the Museum of Fine Arts and is a painter. And talking with her about what these stories mean, we were able to create this short film that we'll show you now that captures some of what these ways that we can show this information using film.
Last semester, my second semester of my freshman year, I took a Greek religion course and I discovered that it's something I'm absolutely in love with. I think that was the moment when it sparked, and I was like, I want to do this because I'm an artist, and so I can make this more interesting to people. I think make it more appealing. If you make it beautiful, people are going to pay attention to it more. I do my birds in a scientific diagram kind of way. I usually take a bird. And then, I go through like 60,000 stock photos of that bird. I go through different books. I go through scientific books and magazines and stuff like that until I find a photo that I like. And then I also look for wings or skulls or feet or up-close feathers. So you have birds, you have details of them, and then you have information about them. And I've added into them religion. In Greek and Roman religion, birds and animals are very important. You find that throughout all different religious mythology. You find it Native American, Egyptian, Roman, Greek, Norse, Celtic. Through all of these different cultures spread out through the world, you find similarities. As humans, we explain the world around us in a very similar way, and that's what you see in consciousness. I like the idea that maybe someday people will read this and look at it and learn more about different aspects of the culture and religion that was really prominent and that affected our society.
So one thing I touched on was that I think that what's neat is this is a kind of project that's not only bringing all these disciplines together from, different departments for the professors, but that there are all of these different students that I know the ornithology club and certainly all the classics people and then artists and all of these different ways that people engage on a deep level with these different stories. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, we actually have a sophomore in computer science who's working on that. So I don't know, Anthony, if you want to.
Yeah, so Juliet was, I forget if she approached you or me first, but she talked to one of us because she had come across this project, and she's been doing some of the XML markup. So she's kind of grappling with Darcy's writing style and attempting to put in tags and whatnot to help extract information from it. So, that's a little less cool than a video, but nevertheless.
Not at all. I mean, you're getting this access. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, educational. She didn't know XML before she started, so she had to learn that. She didn't know the web technologies very deeply because, it's not something that she had taken coursework on yet. So, she definitely has learned some computer science skills, but then there's also reading these entries because she has to understand what they're saying to mark them up. So, yeah, it's been fascinating.
It's like true interdisciplinary, right? And sort of having people learn this way is just really exciting, I think.
It's been wonderful because I sit with her for markup sessions, and, I ask her, well, if we want to extract this, how should we format this markup? And then she asks me, well, what does that mean? And it's been really fascinating.
No, and he said she was grappling with reading. If you try and read any of the accounts, there's a lot of grappling. I just skim through until I see a bird name and then I stop. And if you want to see it, it's a free download on the internet. So anyone who wants to look at this document is welcome to, but you'll grapple.
Yeah, and I think, to Michael's point, that's really what we're trying to do is render legible something that is such a deep and important resource, but right now it's completely obscured by the fact that he assumed everybody knew Greek and Latin, and also,
had read all of these myths and Aristotle and, random biologists.
It does give you an idea of how education has changed.
Definitely.
The assumption was that these languages were accessible to you.
Yeah.
And they're not.
Yeah. But he was one of the last great polymaths, I think, and that's just a testament to just how deep he was in all these disciplines. So I think that's an important fact, and we always talk about interdisciplinarity, and you know, there needs to be 4 of us plus a bunch of students to unravel his work. So I think that's quite an achievement on the part of Darcy. His dean thought it was odd, too.
Oh, yes. Actually, I mean, he suffered the same thing that sometimes people do suffer, of sort of one discipline wanting you to specialize in that and saying you're, you know, not the world expert in this field. You're just one of great experts in, you know, multiple fields. And now we recognize it as extraordinary. But I think at the time it's hard to fit into the system, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's odd is when I was a graduate student, so long before Tufts, my specialty was, my PhD work was in what's called evolutionary computation, and it's a class of algorithms that sort of mimic evolution in nature, but inside a computer to sort of, you know, solve problems or find things that would be hard to find otherwise. Anyway, I read Darcy. I read his On Growth and Form as part of my graduate work because he talked about concepts, particularly, we saw a slide on this earlier, but how like shapes can kind of be deformed, like one fish is short and squat, and then there's kind of deformation, and you get this fish that is long and thin. He had all kinds of, you know, drawings and writings about this, and he had theories about how organisms grew from, you know, embryo to adult form, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to go too far into that, but it was part of the study for us in my lab to read this. So I had encountered his name, and so when I encountered this project, I'm like, oh, Darcy, I know him. But a different context. But anyway,
so if you're interested in grappling,
read
that book too.
Yes, that's another one.
He said the little book. It's a big book.
Well, we went to this conference. It's the 100th anniversary of On Growth and Form, and we went to the conference in Dundee, and experts from all around the world in such a variety of fields came and talked about this picture. Actually, it came up in everybody's which is sort of that, you know, there's this evolutionary change, but it's within certain parameters. So you don't have a fish that becomes an elephant, right? You have a fish that becomes this other kind of fish, and that you know, things can grow and stretch, but they're not, but they're contained by certain sort of physical laws. So it's this combination of randomness of evolution, but also this lack of randomness of physical properties. So, but you had all of these, you know, mathematicians and you know, chemists, and I mean, just everybody. There's artists and all sorts of people. Obviously, ornithologists, you know, there. But anyway, it was fascinating to sort of see how these kinds of ideas, because they were so, they drew on so many different modes of thinking and different areas of knowledge. They even today bring in all of these different fields.
Yeah, and I think from a classics perspective, it's really heartening to read his work and just understand how much he thought that the classics pervade all of these things, and that was his I guess justification for our field, which I subscribe to, is that this notion that there's the science and so forth, but there's also the meaning behind things and how we're human and how we understand the world, right? So for me, the work on the birds is a lot about that, right? There's the biology of things, but there's a culture here that's understanding these animals, and the two together, they need each other, right? And that's what I'm trying to get at, I think.
Yeah, it's really neat because, you know, nowadays we like to divide things into STEM and humanities, for instance. But in these entries, he mixes them together as if they're on the same plane. So he'll be talking about Aristotle, or then he'll be talking about a myth, and then he'll be talking about a biology book, and then, you know, he'll be writing in Greek. And for him, they were all the same. You know, they were all kind of on the same level to, you know, and they're kind of centered around birds, but there are all these different ways of looking at birds, right? So I think that's pretty neat that you know, he as a person just kind of embodied this this notion that these fields are not distinct like that. They're actually just, they're intertwined.
Yeah, and as a filmmaker, I think that's one thing that really appeals to me, because a lot of film is about sort of different lenses into stories, right? So the fact that he already did this you can immediately translate it visually.
Well, and one of my goals is to help people save birds, and it was a terrible revelation to discover that a bunch of data wasn't sufficient. So I could just explain the reality and people would just do what I wanted. And if you don't connect with people and the passion's not there, it's never going to happen. So it's great to have this ability to cross over and draw more people in that care about it.
Maybe I'll talk about the formal concept analysis. So we've been playing around with this technique called formal concept analysis, and there are some related fields like, or techniques called non-negative matrix factorization methods, just to get all nerdy about it, whereby we sort of represent some of the content of one of the entries as basically a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, and one of the rows of the matrix represent basically mentions in myth of a particular bird. So Eithria in this particular myth, or Eithria in this other myth, or in this spot. And then the kind of columns are different attributes of either the birds as biological entities or as mythical entities, and I think those are the main ones. So for instance, the bird is white, or the bird burrows burrows underground, or but then also things like the bird is associated with death, or the bird is associated with goddesses, or women diving into the sea. These features that we've talked about a little bit earlier. And so I guess you can see an example now of one of these matrices that we started to build. So once you have this data like this, and this takes a fairly close reading of the entry, I think. So Marie-Claire produced this, and it took her quite a while and probably 3 different tries to get this far, and we're still not even sure it's going to work yet. So it may go through a few more iterations. But the idea is once you have this, then there are techniques that allow you to kind of extract latent structure in this, and it's called concepts. Formal concept analysis is the name of the technique we've been trying, and I think concept is a bit of a stretch. It's not really what we think of when we think of concepts intuitively. However, mathematically there's some sense to it, and frequently that corresponds to our intuitions about certain things. So in this little picture, I believe this is the one about the owls and different birds, and somebody, just for this example, built up a matrix of different bird names, and then like owl and hawk and dove, I guess, and then different attributes like whether they're carnivorous or whether I forget what all those ones are. I can't see them from here. But then once you have that, then you can run this method and it extracts a picture like what you're seeing, where you can start to identify like, okay, latent in this data, there's this notion of like predatory birds, or there's this notion of other types of bird, and then from this you can sort of put together the features in the matrix with concepts that you know intuitively about the things in the matrix. And so when we talk about the Eithria, for instance, and the association between, say, a woman diving into the sea and a white-breasted bird, that came out of Marie-Claire's reading of the entry, but ideally we could start to find that stuff in an automated way, or stuff we didn't even know was there, associations among mythical mentions and actual physical properties of the bird, for instance, or properties of the bird when it's mentioned in myth versus what it does as a, behaviorally, for instance, like burrowing or diving. So we're hoping that with techniques like this, we can start to fish out what might be hidden associations, and then from there kind of interpret it or use that to display data back to users, and who knows what we'll do with it. There's lots of fun stuff, but yeah, so we've been working using a method like this as well. And so this is a more data-oriented way of looking at it versus a pictorial or language or whatnot. But yeah, we've been working on this.
But I'd like to follow up on this example, because when you're looking at it, it seems simple, and some of it seems obvious, like 2 legs. So what kind of silly comment is that? It actually turns out to be important because it gives you insight, if you know historically how birds were prepared and discussed and shipped. This is actually can be informative. So in the late 1700s and through the 1800s, there was a really large international trade in specimens, especially rich people sending out collectors. And there's one group of birds out there called birds of paradise that are absolutely amazing. And one of the sources for a lot of these collected birds was natives. We'd go out and collect them because they knew where to find them. And the way they prepared birds of paradise, they removed the legs. So when all these birds were shipped back to the people who purchased them in Europe, they thought the bird didn't have legs. So all the descriptions at the time of this species, well, they must float around all the time because they can't land. So knowing that it's got 2 legs, you don't say, oh, well, every bird's got 2 legs. Well, people used to think they didn't. Mm-hmm. So, and feathers, well, that's the defining characteristics of birds. But a lot of flightless birds, their feathers look like hair because they don't fly and the feathers aren't linked together in that clever way that they do. And what you see if you're just touching it is it feels like fur rather than feathers. So even these simple characteristics, if they're mentioned from a couple of hundred years ago, in Aristotle's time, one of the authorities, they thought there's a barnacle called a gooseneck barnacle, and the barnacle goose is named after because they thought in the winter when the bird disappeared that it became the barnacle. Now, the barnacle has a white patches on both sides of its head, and so does the bird. So they thought part of the year it was a barnacle and part of the year it was a goose. So this can give you really interesting insight into history and writing and what were they talking about at the time. So even some of these simple things that look like they wouldn't be informative could be very informative.
What's so interesting about that is that it would break down some of the data, right? That it wouldn't work, right? Because maybe somebody said this bird has, this species has fur, right? So you wouldn't put it in that chart. So it takes this, again, combination of sort of taking that and then having other people who know this history to say, oh, well, people used to think that it didn't have legs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
To understand even the data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like it really takes all this team to look at this information and make sure it's you know, correct.
Have you run into that? I know you were talking about like the white-breasted and the sort of, you know, trying to grapple with that with the ghost. Are there other examples where a bird seemed like it could be the same or that something did not fit because of the way they understood it at the time?
Yeah, I think so as part of his discussion of the revised identification of the Ituya as a shearwater, Darcy adds several birds, and he says they're also shearwaters, and so that's the memnon and several others. And he had previously identified the memnon as a ruff, which is quite a different bird, right? And he had made that identification on the basis of a myth that these birds fight, and so decided that it's got to be a ruff. But then if he looks at other characteristics, then it starts looking more like a shearwater. So it's a really like day and night kind of shift right there.
And this is sleuthing. So it's natural history sleuthing, myth sleuthing.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
Right. I'm just wondering, like, if you'll start sort of seeing some reclassification that needs to be done even at this point, right?
Yeah.
Because you have more information now.
And actually, Jeffrey Arness did a re-edition, I think it was in 2001, of this, and he disputes some of the identifications still, right? So there's a lot of work, and for me, as a specialist of Greek religion, I'm hoping actually that we'll be able to dispute the associations of certain birds with certain deities. So like what Anthony was mentioning, that there's latent characteristics there. Like people think of Poseidon, for instance, as being the god of the sea, which he is, but that's really on the surface, not to use a bad pun, but Poseidon is really the god of the crust of the earth that holds the sea, to be very precise, and that's why he's the earth shaker, if you read Homer. And so I'm hoping that associations like that would actually come out with birds, for instance, that nest in burrows or something like that, right? Similarly, we see this Ituya come up with Athena as well as Leucothea, and I'm questioning what's the relationship here. But once we have more data, maybe that will become apparent, and we can understand how the Greeks associated some of their gods with particular species, which right now it seems a little bit random. So hopefully we can make some sense of what's going on here.
I like that someone in 2001 was still arguing about the birds. This is classic bird nerd. So he just wanted to argue and said, I'll do it through a book. I don't know. Bird people make lists and arguing about things. This is very common. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned in passing, there's actually an ornithology club on campus. And just in the last 2 years, they've documented, I think, 130 species on campus.
Wow.
So you think our campus has nothing on it, you're not looking hard enough.
It's impressive. So the question is, does this project concern mainly a glossary of Greek birds? Apologies, I joined a few minutes late today. Yes, we're mainly interested in the glossary of Greek birds. Obviously, I think this bleeds into all kinds of other things, and I think that maybe in some kind of El Dorado future, we could do the glossary of Greek fishes.
Well, it's not Greek birds. It's birds mentioned in Greek literature.
Yes.
Because there was a lot of international trade, and one of the birds mentioned is the Egyptian vulture. Not common in Greece, but
that's true.
So there is trade. So things pop up with stories shared among cultures as well.
And I guess we're kind of thinking of the Glossary of Greek birds as a centerpiece, because he cites all sorts of different authorities. And one vision we've had is to have a digital edition of this glossary where the links are actually resolved. So places where he mentions Aristotle could literally be a hyperlink that would bring you to the passage in Aristotle where Aristotle says whatever it is he says. So once that work is done, then the Glossary of Greek birds itself is a centerpiece, but it's this constellation of sources and films and, concept lattices or whatever that turns out to be, and facts about the birds, all sorts of things hanging on this centerpiece. So I feel like it's kind of it's really just the keystone of a very wide range of documents and other media.
So thank you very much. Appreciate the emphasis you are putting on making data sets available and understandable to as large a public as possible. Will tools that you develop be available to anyone with an internet connection? Yes, absolutely. We're very dedicated to open source and open access. As Michael mentioned earlier, I think Darcy's works are in the public domain, so all of this is free for anyone to use. Of course, right now it's available as a PDF in this format that Darcy put it in, so our job is actually to parse that out, right, and make that even more available. But any data we produce and any software will be open source.
I think we had talked about making linked open data.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, we're not selling it? Out of here.
So I think, for instance, we might, once we get more into the markup, make something that's a little bit more semantic web friendly, so linked open data perhaps, or whatever the favorite format in the future is. But it should be in a format that would be easily usable with web development tools, for instance.
You mean in terms of being able to read what we did to make it look like that, or?
The slide with the markup that Marie-Claire showed, that sort of markup, we would make that available. But there are ways to do that markup such that a web browser can render it in a pretty way that looks visually nice and so on. And we can distribute that. I think the core data set would be useful for other purposes besides what we put it to. So.
Really interesting question from Laura Mack. How do you envision artists working with this database? Are there visual components to search?
Yeah, so for example, when we were looking at Darcy's scrapbook annotations and things, there's a tremendous amount of visual material there of pictures of birds, and he has these sketches even in the second edition. And I think that the stories also lend themselves to artists. One of the people that I interviewed is a student, but he also is a novelist, and he uses these myths to sort of ground modern retellings of stories. So you could do it in literature. Obviously, Bella, that we showed the short video, who uses these as an inspiration for visual art. So I think that there's all sorts of different ways that it sparks artistic creativity.
And the key is to make it accessible.
Exactly.
So it can do that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm always surprised at the diversity of students who take these classes, right? So like Bella is just one example among so many writers, artists, gaming artists of all kinds that I've taught over the years, and I'm sure that's true of all you guys. But I was really struck when we started this project at just how diverse of an audience can get something out of this.
It's true. I mean, every time we sort of, I'll mention this just in casual, conversation, and people will hook into one of these things and say, oh, I love birds. I've always been into birds. Or Greek myth. Oh my gosh, I just devoured them as a kid, or whatever it might be, or computer science. That there are these passions that people have. So I think that is such an interesting thing, that the students themselves to see all these different artists that have taken your classes and what they'll make of that material, just even sort of processing it and then making their own work that's informed in some way from this knowledge.
I think Darcy would love this, actually, that everyone is making something new with his work. I think he would be thrilled to see that happen. Yeah. He was himself, like, really in favor of all of this interdisciplinary work happening with his data, and he was also really a big support to his students. So you see that in his correspondence. He's like really pushed the career of many students, in particular women who were not that prominent in science at the time.
That.
Yeah,
wow.
So he was.
So in what way? What was sort of a mentor?
He was a mentor and helped them find positions and favored the establishment of their labs and so forth, right? So he was really a big advocate of diversity in science and in the scholarly world. So I think he would be proud to see all this.
That is so neat. There's another area of artistic creation, which we haven't really done yet, but I've just started this collaboration with John McDonald, who's a professor in the music department at Composer, and so I've been working with student composers, undergraduates and graduate students, and so with this, I can see looking at this material, and certainly in a very specific way, having them compose music for some of these short films that we're making, and just I could see it inspiring compositions, because when you look at this material, especially this book that was so magical, you could see it really inspiring composition. So I think we have no way to predict kind of what new knowledge, what new sort of creations will come out of it, but it is just so rich. It's exciting.
So exciting, absolutely.
Yeah. And you can't tell. I have a friend who's a biochemist, and he's working with someone in music, and students are writing music inspired by protein coding and DNA.
Whoa.
Not where you would have gone ahead of time.
Yeah.
So it's what emerges from it.
So could the results of your findings have the ability to change how we've previously understood historical works? If so, what does that mean for future education? Great question. Does anyone want to pick that up? I guess I'll take a stab at it. So I think if by historical works you mean classical works, certainly. I definitely think that digging into this data is going to reveal patterns, as Anthony explained, that are not immediately visible. Even when I read one of these entries, I'm like, okay, there's a bit of Odyssey, there's a bit of Aristotle, and I can deal with those texts, but it's making the connection that is not necessarily easy for just one brain in the one surface. So I think definitely we're going to understand much better what these texts are talking about, and I think I was mentioning, like, we'll understand better the religion that's behind that, because for the Greeks, there is no distinction between the secular and the religious world, right? So they see a bird, it could be a god too, right? Or there's a domain of overlap right there, right? They know it's a bird, but it's also part of the divine, just like all the rest of life, right? So I definitely think we'll understand ancient culture much better. I also think, we're talking about all these new things that are spurred by this. I think that we're going to understand a lot better what's going on in our world. What do we do with this? How do we deal with this sort of heritage, and what does it mean today? I think that's a great question that's being posed by this.
Yeah, and I mean, second part of your question about students, that this kind of way of looking at something that has tremendous density and giving it context and giving it structure so that you can start to systematically comprehend it, right? So I think that's something that all of us are in this world today where we're inundated with information. And how do we start to basically develop these systems of understanding it in a rigorous, comprehensive way? That's extremely difficult. So using some of these techniques really just, I think, can help students start to think about ways of taking information and making it useful to them in a whole wide variety of disciplines.
And actually, the coding that Anthony's running can pull out patterns people hadn't seen before.
Absolutely.
As well. So that's, people are finding code patterns that don't exist. So we certainly ought to be able to find patterns that do exist.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thanks to all my colleagues for this wonderful collaboration. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And stay posted.
Right.
Yeah.